She invited her ex-boyfriend to her wedding to humiliate him, but what happened next will shock you.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Samuel held the invitation card in his hand, his eyes lingering on the bold letters, Ellen y Julian, an eternal union. His heart tightened as he read her name, Ellen, the woman who had once been his entire world. Emotions surged, pulling him back to memories long buried. 7 years ago, Ellen had been more than just a girlfriend, she was the person he believed he would build a life with. They had spent long afternoons by the river, talking about simple dreams. But everything abruptly changed when Julian, a wealthy man, entered her life. Julian embodied everything Samuel lacked: power, money, and a cocky confidence. Ellen chose to leave behind their deep love to step into a more luxurious world. What do you think? Are you going? Charles, Samuel's best friend, snapped him back to reality. Charles leaned against the doorframe, his expression full of concern. You'd be crazy to attend. Isn't this just a farce? Samuel pressed his lips together. He knew Charles was right. Attending this wedding would be like reopening old wounds, but a part of him craved to confront the past. I can't keep running, Charles. This is my chance to close this chapter once and for all. Charles shrugged but continued to plead. Samuel, think it through. You'll just be a laughingstock. Ellen and Julian didn't invite you because they want to see you. It's just a way for them to flaunt their victory. Then let them think that, Samuel replied calmly, though his eyes betrayed his determination. I need to do this, not for them, but for myself. Samuel's words made Charles sigh in resignation. He said nothing more, knowing his friend was stubborn and that once Samuel made up his mind, no one could change it. As night fell, Samuel sat alone in his small room, gazing at the old suit hanging neatly on the chair. It was all he had to wear to such a grand event. The light from the desk lamp highlighted the frayed stitching, but he didn't care. His simplicity was something he had always taken pride in. Looking at the invitation again, Samuel recalled the last moment he and Ellen shared. It was a rainy afternoon when she came to see him in a pale blue dress, her eyes filled with guilt. I'm sorry, Samuel. I can't keep doing this. I need a better life. What about our love? He had asked, his voice choking. I love you, Ellen said, but her eyes avoided his. But sometimes love isn't enough. That was the last time they saw each other, and from that moment, Samuel's life had become a struggle to forget. The next morning, Charles arrived at Samuel's home with a large paper bag. You can't wear that old suit, Charles said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. I don't want you looking like someone who's been abandoned. Don't worry. I'll be fine, Samuel tried to smile. Charles wouldn't let it go. You might not care about appearances, but you need to show them you haven't crumbled. This is your chance to hold your head high. Samuel looked at his friend, feeling both grateful and conflicted. Charles, I don't want to borrow anything else. I already owe you too much. Don't say that. I'm your friend, and I want you to have the chance to stand tall. Take it. Charles shoved the bag into Samuel's hands, refusing to let him decline. The night before the wedding, Samuel sat at his desk, adjusting the new shirt. It fit well and gave him a slight boost of confidence, however small. But his thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt. Should I even go? He asked himself. What's the point of facing people who've looked down on me? The questions swirled in his mind, but he took a deep breath and decided that, no matter what, he wouldn't let fear control him. The next morning, Samuel boarded the bus to the city, his heart in turmoil but his gaze resolute. Charles saw him off at the station, patting his shoulder and saying, I don't agree with this, but I understand. Just remember, don't let them make you feel small. You're worth more than that. Samuel smiled gratefully. Thank you, Charles. You've always been my best friend. At the wedding venue, Julian and Ellen were busy preparing for the lavish ceremony. Ellen stood in front of a mirror in her opulent dressing room, her pristine white gown glowing, though her mind wandered elsewhere. Julian entered, placing a hand on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his tone curious. "Nothing," Ellen replied, forcing a smile. "It's just a big day. I'm a little nervous." Julian chuckled, not noticing the unease in her eyes. "Don't worry, my love. Everything will be perfect. We'll be the center of attention." Ellen nodded, but deep down, she knew Samuel's presence at the wedding could upend everything. Samuel sat before the mirror in his small room, his eyes focused on his reflection. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, feeling the nervousness creeping in. The suit Charles had given him lay neatly on the chair, gleaming faintly in the morning light. "Why am I doing this?" Samuel muttered, but no answer came. Perhaps it was to face the past or to find closure. He wasn't sure, but having made the decision, there was no turning back. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Carmen, the landlady of the boarding house where Samuel rented a room, stepped in. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp yet kind eyes. "Young man, are you really going to that wedding?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and concern. Samuel gave a faint smile as he adjusted his collar. "I have to, Mrs. Carmen. This is something I can't keep running from." Mrs. Carmen shook her head, her gaze contemplative. "You're a good boy, but sometimes being too good is foolish. People like Julian and Ellen don't deserve your presence." Samuel thanked her with a weak smile. "I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing it for myself." That entire morning, Samuel busied himself preparing. He carefully ironed his shirt and polished his old shoes, which had been with him for years. As he worked, Charles's and Mrs. Carmen's words echoed in his mind. Were they right? Was he setting himself up for more pain? Yet deep down, he knew he had to go. By noon, Samuel was finally ready. He stood before the mirror, straightening his tie, staring at his reflection. A flicker of confidence shone in his eyes, fragile but present. He took a deep breath before stepping out. At the bus station, Charles waited, leaning against an old bicycle. "You're really going, huh?" Charles asked one last time, his eyes filled with concern. "Yes, I'm going," Samuel replied firmly. He patted his friend's shoulder, sensing the worry Charles couldn't hide. "Thank you for everything, Charles. No matter what happens, I won't forget your kindness." Charles looked at him for a long moment before sighing. "All right, just remember that I'm always here if you need me. Don't let them bring you down, Samuel." Samuel nodded and stepped onto the bus. He chose a seat near the window, his eyes gazing outside at the golden fields rushing by. A mix of anxiety and anticipation churned within him, like two streams merging into one inseparable flow. Meanwhile, at the Grand Cathedral in the city center, Julian was busy overseeing the final preparations. He wore a sleek black suit, a perfectly knotted tie, and polished leather shoes without a single scuff. Ellen stood beside him in a dazzling white wedding gown, her gaze distracted as Julian conversed with the event staff. "Do you think Samuel will come?" Ellen asked unexpectedly, her voice soft but tinged with meaning. Julian turned, smirking. "If he has the nerve, he'll show up. But don't worry, Ellen. He can't do anything. Today is our day, after all." Ellen gave a faint smile, but unease stirred inside her. She couldn't understand why thoughts of Samuel lingered on a day as significant as this. Perhaps it was old memories, or maybe something deeper she dared not confront. The bus stopped in front of the cathedral. Samuel stepped off, his eyes immediately drawn to the grandeur of the place. Intricately carved angel statues adorned the facade, and white marble columns reflected the blinding sunlight. The guests, dressed in elegant attire, walked through the massive gates as if entering another world entirely. Samuel felt out of place from the very first moment. But summoning all his courage, he stepped forward, blending into the crowd. Some guests turned to look at him, their eyes filled with curiosity and subtle judgment. They whispered among themselves, but Samuel forced himself to ignore them. At the entrance, a young woman holding a checklist stopped him. "What's your name?" she asked politely, though her scrutinizing gaze was hard to miss. "Samuel." "Samuel Lopez," he answered, feeling the weight of each word. She scanned the list, frowning briefly before masking it. "Ah, yes. You're at table 12, at the back of the hall." She pointed toward a distant corner. Samuel nodded in thanks and walked inside. The hall was enormous, lavishly decorated with white and gold flowers and glittering lights. He felt like an outsider in a world that wasn't his. Table 12 was tucked away in a far corner, almost obscured by large pillars. When he reached his table, a few people seated there turned to glance at him, but none spoke. Samuel pulled out a chair and sat down, feeling a palpable sense of isolation. Bitterness rose within him, but he reminded himself not to let it weaken his resolve. Meanwhile, Julian and Ellen greeted their guests. Julian smiled broadly, shaking hands with everyone, while Ellen stood beside him, maintaining a polite smile. But when her eyes scanned the hall and landed on Samuel sitting quietly at his table, her smile faltered for a moment. "He's here," Ellen murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "I knew he would be," Julian replied, a hint of smugness in his tone. "Now let's see what he'll do." Samuel sat silently at table 12, far from the center of the hall, as though deliberately placed out of sight. He looked around and noticed the stark contrast. The other tables were adorned with elaborate floral arrangements and glowing candles, while his table had only a few small flowers and no candles at all. The others at his table were strangers. A middle-aged woman with a judgmental gaze, a young couple preoccupied with their phones, and an older man who seemed disinterested in the entire event. None of them acknowledged Samuel, and he wasn't inclined to initiate conversation. Laughter and chatter echoed from the other tables, mingling with the clinking of glasses and congratulatory toasts. Samuel sat there, trying to stay composed, but the feelings of alienation and discomfort grew stronger. He began to question whether coming here had been a mistake. At the main table, Julian stepped onto the stage with a radiant smile. Holding a microphone, he waved to the crowd, his voice brimming with confidence. "Welcome, everyone, to this special day. Today isn't just the happiest day of my life and Ellen's, but also a day to share our joy with the people we hold dearest." The hall erupted in applause and cheers. Samuel watched Julian from afar, a bitter taste rising in his mouth. Julian seemed perfect, confident, powerful, and in possession of everything. Yet Samuel knew that behind the polished exterior was an insufferable arrogance. Ellen stood beside Julian, her smile dazzling yet unrecognizable to Samuel. It was no longer the warm, genuine smile he had once known. Now it felt cold and distant, like a wall separating her from the world she used to belong to. The reception began. Course after course of exquisite dishes was served, each presented like a work of art. The others at Samuel's table started to chat among themselves, but no one directed a word his way. Occasionally, they glanced at him with curiosity or even disdain. Samuel tried to ignore it, focusing on the food in front of him, though he had little appetite. "Who are you a guest of?" the middle-aged woman suddenly asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Samuel hesitated for a moment before replying. "I'm an old friend of Ellen's." "Ah," she nodded, asking no further questions. Her gaze flicked briefly over his suit before she turned to speak with someone else. Samuel felt the weight of the silent judgment. It reminded him of the struggles he faced after Ellen left. He knew he couldn't compare to Julian, but that didn't lessen the sting of the memories. At the main table, Julian and Ellen continued to receive congratulations. A middle-aged man, clearly a friend of Julian's, stood with his glass raised and spoke loudly. "Julian, you truly are a lucky man. Ellen isn't just a beautiful woman but the perfect match for you. Cheers to your everlasting happiness." The hall erupted in applause. Ellen smiled faintly, while Julian beamed with pride. Samuel observed from afar, feeling each word like a dagger to his heart. As the evening progressed, Julian left the main table and walked toward Samuel. He wore a polite smile, but it was tinged with mockery as he stood before Samuel. "Samuel, what a surprise to see you here," Julian said, his voice low but laced with condescension. "I didn't think you'd come." Samuel rose, maintaining his composure. "I received the invitation and thought I should come." "Of course, we invited you," Julian replied, his tone dripping with insinuation. "It's wonderful to see you've moved on and can offer us your blessings." Samuel clenched his teeth, fighting to stay calm. "I wish you both happiness." "Thank you," Julian said, patting Samuel on the shoulder in a gesture that seemed friendly but was utterly fake. "I know this must not be easy for you. But don't worry, everyone eventually finds their own path." As Julian walked away, Samuel sat back down, his heart heavy with bitterness. Julian's words were nothing but a veiled insult, but Samuel refused to react. He reminded himself that he hadn't come here to argue or cause a scene. From a distance, Ellen watched Samuel. Her expression showed a flicker of guilt, quickly replaced by unease. She knew his presence unsettled her, stirring old memories that made it difficult to focus on the celebration. "What's wrong?" Julian asked, noticing the change in Ellen's demeanor. "Nothing," Ellen replied, forcing a smile. "I'm just a little tired." Julian raised an eyebrow but said no more. He turned back to the other guests, leaving Ellen to her own thoughts. The reception continued, but for Samuel, time seemed to drag on. He sat there, feeling like an outsider among strangers. The laughter, the clinking glasses, and the glittering lights only deepened his sense of isolation. As dinner ended, the servers began clearing the tables to prepare for the dancing and toasts. Samuel remained in his seat, quietly observing. He knew the most challenging part of the evening was likely yet to come. The music began, signaling the livelier phase of the event. The hall dimmed, and colorful lights started to flash as couples moved to the dance floor, enjoying the joyous atmosphere. Samuel stayed in his seat, his gaze wandering absent-mindedly over the crowd. "Aren't you going to dance?" a voice asked beside him. Samuel turned to see a young woman with long black hair in a striking red dress. She introduced herself, "I'm Natalie. I'm sitting at the next table and noticed you've been sitting here alone, so I thought I'd say hi." Samuel managed a faint smile. "It's nice to meet you, Natalie. But I don't think I fit in with this atmosphere." Natalie smiled back, her eyes curious. "You don't seem like the other guests here. Are you a friend of the groom or the bride?" "The bride," Samuel answered briefly, hoping she wouldn't press further. But Natalie wasn't easily discouraged. "Really? How long have you known Ellen?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. "A long time," Samuel said, his tone growing more subdued. "But that's in the past." Sensing his discomfort, Natalie didn't push further. "Well, I hope you can find some enjoyment in this party," she said before standing and returning to her table. Natalie's brief interaction brought Samuel a small sense of relief, but it wasn't enough to erase the bitterness within him. He glanced toward the main table, where Julian and Ellen were laughing and chatting with important guests. Ellen looked radiant under the shimmering lights, but to Samuel, her beauty now felt as distant as a dream he could never reach. "Good evening, everyone." Julian's voice suddenly boomed over the microphone, drawing all eyes toward him. He stood in the middle of the stage, his face beaming with smug confidence. "Today is a momentous day for Ellen and me, and I want to share a little story with all of you." Samuel felt his chest tighten. He could already guess what Julian was about to say, and it didn't bode well. "Ellen and I have had a wonderful journey to reach this day," Julian said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before landing on Samuel. But before she met me, Ellen had a rather interesting relationship. And the main character of that story happens to be here tonight. The hall fell silent, and all eyes began searching for Samuel. He felt the weight of their stares bearing down on him. Sitting up straight, he tried to maintain his composure, though anger churned within him. Julian continued, his tone growing more mocking. He was her former lover, a kind-hearted guy but lacking ambition. As everyone knows, Ellen is an incredible woman who deserves the best. And so, she chose me. Laughter erupted from a few tables, though most guests remained quiet, likely uncomfortable with Julian's words. Samuel clenched his fists under the table, struggling to control his emotions. He didn't want to cause a scene, but the humiliation was nearly unbearable. At the main table, Ellen stood frozen. She hadn't known Julian planned to say such things, and it made her deeply uncomfortable. She turned to him and whispered, "What are you doing? This isn't something to joke about." Julian smiled and whispered back, "Relax, my love. It's our wedding. I just want to add a bit of fun." Ellen felt anger rising within her but chose to stay silent, not wanting to disrupt the event. Her eyes, however, betrayed her disapproval. Samuel, still at his table, felt the weight of the room's attention. An older man sitting nearby spoke up, his tone tinged with sarcasm. "So, you're the bride's ex. How fascinating. What do you do now? Tell us about it." Samuel turned to the man, his gaze sharp. "I don't think that's any of your business." The man shrugged but pressed on. "Well, I was just curious. You must be quite special to have caught Julian's attention." Samuel didn't reply. He kept his eyes fixed on the stage, where Julian continued his story, each word cutting deeper into him. More laughter erupted as Julian concluded his tale. He raised his glass in a toast, smiling triumphantly before returning to the main table. Samuel knew, however, that the evening was far from over. The humiliation he had just endured was only the beginning. He sighed, his expression momentarily weary. But instead of leaving, he resolved to stay. Samuel knew that if he walked out now, he would forever feel like the defeated one. And that was something he refused to accept. In another corner of the hall, Natalie observed Samuel. She could sense the pain he was enduring but also saw something resilient in his eyes. Turning to her friend, she murmured, "He's not like the others here. I want to know his story." Her friend shrugged. "Maybe he's just a loser. Who cares?" Natalie didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on Samuel. She wondered what had brought him here and why he chose to stay, even though it was clear he didn't belong. Samuel sat quietly at table 12, his eyes fixed on the glass of water before him. Inside, he was a storm of emotions, but outwardly, he remained composed. The soft music playing in the background was nothing more than a faint blur in his mind. "Well, what an interesting story, isn't it?" a man's voice called out mockingly from behind. Samuel turned around to see a young man with slick back hair and an expensive suit standing in front of him. "You're Samuel, aren't you? The legendary ex-lover of Ellen?" Samuel stood, meeting the man's gaze head-on but saying nothing. The young man continued, unfazed by Samuel's silence. "Don't you think coming here today was a peculiar choice? I've heard about you. Don't you feel a little out of place here? And what makes you think my being here affects you in any way?" Samuel asked, his voice low but firm, his gaze unwavering. The man shrugged, the mocking smile still plastered on his face. "Not really. I'm just curious. What are you trying to prove by attending this special day? Or are you just here to remind Ellen of what she left behind?" Samuel pressed his lips together, refusing to respond. He knew that any words would only escalate the situation. Instead of engaging, he turned back to his table and sat down, ignoring the man. But the humiliation he'd just endured reignited the fire burning inside him. At the center of the hall, Julian was chatting with his group of friends. One of them clapped him on the shoulder, laughing loudly. "You're really bold to tell that story. But hey, that Samuel guy looks pretty pathetic. Don't you think you went a bit too far?" Julian smirked, taking a sip of his wine. "Too far? Not at all. Samuel needs to know his place. He thought love was enough. But in this world, money and power are everything." "But what if he reacts?" another friend asked, his tone tinged with concern. Julian shrugged. "He won't. Guys like Samuel only know how to suffer in silence. He's no threat." Ellen stood nearby, overhearing everything but saying nothing. She turned away, feeling stifled. Julian's words, though she didn't agree with them, felt like a cruel confirmation of the choices she had made in the past. Deep down, however, she knew she had hurt Samuel, and the guilt weighed heavily on her. Samuel tried to maintain his composure, but the mockery didn't stop there. A woman sitting near his table, her appearance flashy and her voice shrill, called out loudly. "You there, I heard you used to be the bride's boyfriend. That's fascinating. So, what do you do now? Surely it must be something special to earn an invitation here." Laughter rippled through the group, and Samuel felt all the eyes in the room turn toward him. He took a deep breath and answered curtly, "I'm just an ordinary man." "Oh, an ordinary man," the woman continued, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "How humble. But I suppose Ellen must have seen something greater in Julian, right?" The laughter erupted again, and Samuel felt as though he was being pushed to the very edge of humiliation. Yet, instead of reacting, he bowed his head and stayed silent. He knew that anything he said would only be used against him. At the head table, Julian watched the scene unfold and smirked. "See? He really is a loser," he said quietly to his friend. But Ellen, sitting beside him, didn't laugh. She turned to Julian, her eyes sharp. "Don't you think that's enough?" Ellen asked, her voice low but firm. "Enough of what?" "I'm just joking," Julian replied nonchalantly. "Joking? Don't you see you've gone too far?" Ellen's voice tightened, making Julian pause briefly. But then he shrugged again, as if what he had done was perfectly acceptable. Ellen sighed, turning away, her dissatisfaction growing. She knew there was nothing she could do to change the situation, but that didn't ease the guilt gnawing at her heart. As the evening wore on, Samuel left his table and stepped outside. He needed some fresh air to clear the suffocating tension. Under the faint moonlight, he stood still, gazing at the distant stars in the sky. "Are you all right?" a voice asked behind him. Samuel turned to see Natalie standing there, her eyes filled with concern. "I'm fine," Samuel replied, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "I saw how they treated you," Natalie said, stepping closer. "You don't have to put up with this. Why don't you just leave?" Samuel looked at her, his eyes steady. "I can't leave. If I walk away, they'll think they've won. I need to prove that I'm not easily defeated." Natalie nodded, understanding the conviction in his words. "You're stronger than they think, Samuel. Don't let people like that diminish you." Samuel didn't respond, but a faint smile touched his lips. Natalie's words, though simple, gave him a sliver of strength to carry on. He took a deep breath and returned to the hall, ready to face whatever remained of the night. Samuel walked back into the hall, the tension still weighing on him. Though he had steeled himself beforehand, the events of the evening thus far had left a heavy burden on his heart. The music, the laughter, and the sparkling lights only heightened the loneliness he felt. Back at table 12, Samuel quietly observed the room. The party was still lively, and it seemed as though no one paid him any attention. However, he noticed a few glances cast in his direction from time to time, expressions filled with curiosity, judgment, and even disdain. At the center of the hall, Julian picked up the microphone again, preparing for another speech. His smug smile was still plastered on his face, and Samuel knew that something unpleasant was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice echoing through the hall. "Today is truly a special day for Ellen and me. I feel like the luckiest man in the world to have her by my side." The hall erupted into applause, but Samuel remained silent. He couldn't deny that Julian and Ellen looked perfect together, but that perfection felt like a knife twisting in his heart. Julian continued, his tone shifting to one tinged with humor. "But you know, before me, Ellen had a few other options in love. And today, we're lucky to have one of those options here with us." The room seemed to freeze for a moment before light laughter rippled through a few tables. Samuel felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. He wasn't surprised, but that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. "Yes, I'm talking about Samuel," Julian said, pointing toward table 12. "A great guy, but unfortunately, not Ellen's final choice." Laughter grew louder, and Samuel clenched his fists under the table, feeling as if his dignity was being crushed. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, but the public humiliation was unbearable. At the head table, Ellen stood up and approached Julian. She tugged gently at his sleeve, whispering with a look of discontent, "Please stop. Don't make things worse." Julian shrugged and chuckled dismissively. "Relax, Ellen. It's just a bit of fun. Everyone loves a good joke at a wedding." "But this isn't something to joke about," Ellen snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. Still, Julian ignored her and continued his speech. Samuel, still seated, felt everything around him blur. He could sense the mockery from those around him, but at the same time, a sense of resolve began to build within him. He had endured too much to let one evening break him. "You don't have to stay here," a gentle voice spoke from behind. Samuel turned and saw Natalie, the woman he had met earlier, standing there with a sympathetic expression. "They don't deserve your presence." Samuel smiled faintly but didn't reply immediately. After a moment, he said, "I'm not here for them. I'm here for myself." Natalie nodded, her eyes filled with respect. "Then show them that you're stronger than they think." Julian continued speaking, but Samuel no longer heard the words clearly. He stood up and walked slowly toward the stage, drawing the attention of the entire room. A hush fell over the crowd as they realized Samuel was moving forward. Julian noticed him, the smirk on his face fading. "Oh, Samuel. Do you have something you'd like to say?" Samuel stopped in the middle of the room, his gaze steady yet unyielding. "No, I have nothing to say," he replied, his voice deep but clear. "But I want to thank you all for tonight. You've reminded me that I don't need anyone's approval to have value." The room fell into silence. Samuel's words, though simple, carried an unexpected power. Julian stood there, his expression confused, unsure how to respond. Samuel turned and walked back to his table. He felt the eyes of everyone on him, but this time, he no longer sensed ridicule. Instead, he felt as if he had reclaimed a piece of the dignity he thought he'd lost. As the evening wore on and the party began to wind down, Samuel rose to leave. Natalie approached him again, smiling softly. "You truly are a man worthy of respect, Samuel. I hope you know that." "Thank you, Natalie," Samuel replied, his voice gentle yet sincere. "Thank you for standing by me on a night like this." Natalie looked at him for a moment before saying, "I hope we'll meet again." Samuel simply smiled, then turned and walked out of the hall. He felt lighter, even though the events of the evening left scars deep within him. Under the moonlight, Samuel paused briefly, looking up at the sky. He took a deep breath, then walked on, determined to start a new chapter in his life. The wedding party was winding down, but the atmosphere inside remained lively. Samuel had left the hall and stood alone outside, feeling the cool night breeze against his face. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the exhaustion and bitterness lingering in his heart. However, before he could leave, a familiar voice called out from behind. "Samuel, wait." He turned to see Mrs. Maria, the woman who had been both his and Ellen's tutor in their younger years. Her small frame stood firm, her face full of kindness. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Mrs. Maria?" Samuel said in surprise, not expecting to see the woman he once deeply respected on this night. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Maria stepped closer, her eyes filled with concern. "I came for Ellen. But when I saw you in the hall, I couldn't leave without speaking to you." Samuel gave a faint smile. "As you can see, I wasn't exactly welcome here. But I had prepared myself for that." "You're wrong, Samuel," Mrs. Maria said, her voice calm yet firm. "You don't need to prove anything to these people. But I'm here to remind you of something, that you are worthy of respect, not just because of your past with Ellen, but because of the man you've become." Samuel bowed his head, silently listening. Mrs. Maria's words, though simple, brought him an indescribable sense of relief. Before he could respond, she continued, her voice dropping to a softer tone, "What Julian and the others did tonight was wrong. And I won't let them continue without addressing the truth." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Mrs. Maria smiled gently, though her eyes burned with determination. "Come back to the hall with me. I have something to say to all of them." "There's no need, Mrs. Maria," Samuel shook his head. "I don't want to make things more complicated. It doesn't matter to me anymore." "But it matters to me," Mrs. Maria replied, her voice resolute. "They need to know the truth about who you are. They need to know that you sacrificed so Ellen could have the life she does today. And they need to understand that Julian, with all his wealth and arrogance, could never compare to you." Samuel felt his resolve waver, but he couldn't refuse Mrs. Maria's firm insistence. Together, they returned to the hall, where the party continued under sparkling lights. The chatter and laughter filled the air, but when Mrs. Maria entered, the room fell silent. Her presence, though small, carried an undeniable strength. Mrs. Maria walked straight to the center, where Julian and Ellen stood. Julian, still chatting with a group of friends, looked up and frowned slightly at the sight of her. "Mrs. Maria? What are you doing here?" Julian asked, his voice filled with surprise. "I'm here to tell the truth," Mrs. Maria replied, her voice clear and commanding the attention of everyone around. Ellen moved closer, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Mrs. Maria, what's going on?" Mrs. Maria turned to Ellen, her gaze softening. "Ellen, I've always loved you as if you were my own daughter. But tonight, I can't stand by and watch Samuel be treated so unfairly. Do you remember what you told me years ago when you decided to leave Samuel?" Ellen said nothing, but her eyes dropped as though the memories Mrs. Maria invoked were flooding back. "It was Samuel," Mrs. Maria continued, her voice growing firmer, "who did everything he could to help you achieve your dreams. Do you remember who worked extra hours, sacrificing his money and time so you could attend the university you always wanted? Do you remember who stood behind you, encouraging you during your toughest moments?" The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to Ellen, leaving her no room to hide. Julian, now visibly uncomfortable, stepped forward as if to interrupt, but Mrs. Maria raised her hand, stopping him. "Don't interrupt me, Julian," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. "And you, Samuel, do you think your sacrifices meant nothing?" Samuel shook his head but said nothing. His throat tightened, and the bitterness he had held on to all evening began to dissipate. Mrs. Maria turned to face the crowd, her voice growing even stronger. "We often judge people by what they own, but the truth is, the value of a person lies in what they've done for others. And today, I want all of you to know that Samuel is such a person. A man who doesn't need wealth or power to prove his worth." Her words brought a profound silence to the hall. Some guests began whispering, and Samuel could feel the shift in the room. The disdainful gazes were replaced with respect. Julian, standing frozen on the stage, seemed at a loss for words. Ellen looked at Samuel, her eyes glistening with tears, as if she had just realized something she had overlooked for years. After a moment of quiet, Samuel stepped forward. He looked at Mrs. Maria and said softly, "Thank you, but I don't need them to understand. I've already found my answer." Mrs. Maria smiled, her eyes glowing with pride. "You are truly the man I always believed you to be, Samuel." The atmosphere in the hall grew somber after Mrs. Maria's powerful words. Ellen lowered her head, avoiding eye contact as the truth was laid bare. The people around her, including those who had laughed at Samuel, were now silent. Some guests began murmuring, their glances shifting between Julian and Samuel, filled with curiosity and regret. Julian, who had basked in his arrogance all night, now felt the ground beneath him give way. Trying to regain his composure, he stepped forward, forcing a small laugh to break the tension. "All right, Mrs. Maria," Julian said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I won't deny that Samuel played an important role in Ellen's past. But today is our wedding. Is it really necessary to bring up these old stories?" Mrs. Maria's eyes narrowed, and she responded without hesitation. "Yes, Julian, it is necessary. Because you turned tonight into a stage to ridicule Samuel. If you have the audacity to do that in front of everyone, then I think you should also have the courage to face the truth." Her words left Julian speechless. A few guests nodded in agreement, making Julian feel increasingly cornered. From the other side of the hall, an older man stood up. It was Mr. Philip, an old family friend of Ellen's. He walked over to Samuel, placed a hand on his shoulder, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Samuel, I don't know the full story, but now I understand that you are a man of great integrity. What you've done for Ellen and her family is something not everyone would do." Samuel looked at Mr. Philip, his eyes wide with surprise. "Thank you, but I only did what I thought was right." "Right or not, you sacrificed so much," Mr. Philip continued, his gaze filled with admiration. "People like you are the role models we should look up to." Mr. Philip's sincere words eased the heaviness in Samuel's heart. While he didn't seek praise, this recognition felt like a balm to the pain he had endured. Meanwhile, Ellen wrestled with her thoughts. She knew everything Mrs. Maria said was true, and now, memories of Samuel flooded her mind like an uncontrollable tide. She remembered the days Samuel worked tirelessly to save money for her education. She recalled his encouraging and trusting eyes every time she felt lost. And she remembered her own decision to leave him, lured by promises of a more luxurious life. Taking a deep breath, Ellen stepped forward. Standing in front of Samuel, she hesitated, her voice trembling. "Samuel. I'm sorry. I know an apology can't undo what I've done, but I need you to know that I regret it deeply." The hall was silent as everyone listened intently to Ellen's words. Samuel looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion, but he refused to let them control him. "Ellen, you don't need to apologize. What's in the past can't be changed, and I've learned to accept that." "But I hurt you," Ellen said, her voice breaking. "I chose Julian because I thought he could give me a better life. But I've never forgotten everything you did for me." Samuel shook his head, a faint smile forming on his lips. "Ellen, what matters isn't what you did in the past but that you're happy now. That's all I ever wanted for you." Julian, standing nearby, couldn't contain his anger. He stepped between Ellen and Samuel, his voice sharp. "All right, I think that's enough. This is our wedding, not a ceremony to honor Samuel." Mrs. Maria, still nearby, fixed Julian with a piercing gaze. "Julian, you should be silent and listen. If it weren't for Samuel, you would never have had Ellen in your life. Be grateful instead of angry." Mrs. Maria's words left Julian with no retort. He looked around, realizing that the room's sympathy had shifted toward Samuel. Reluctantly, he stepped back and stayed quiet. The tension in the hall began to ease, and Samuel decided it was time to leave. He stepped up to the stage, taking the microphone. His voice was clear and steady as he spoke. "Thank you all for tonight. I didn't come here to cause trouble or hurt anyone. I only wanted to wish Ellen and Julian a happy life. Whatever we were to each other in the past, I believe everyone deserves to find joy in their own way." Samuel's words left the hall in a brief silence. Then, a few people began clapping, and soon, the applause spread across the room. Samuel set the microphone down and walked toward the exit, leaving a lasting impression on everyone there. As he stepped outside, Natalie hurried after him. "Samuel, wait," she called, her voice filled with concern. He stopped and turned to face her. "Is there something you need, Natalie?" Natalie smiled softly, her eyes full of admiration. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. If I were in your position, I don't think I could have done the same." Samuel smiled back. "Sometimes we don't know how strong we are until we have no other choice." Natalie nodded, and before leaving, she said, "I hope we meet again. I believe there are many great things waiting for you in life." Samuel watched Natalie walk away, feeling a warm sense of comfort. A new chapter in his life was beginning, and this time, he would move forward with confidence and peace. As Samuel walked slowly down the moonlit road, the rustling wind in the trees felt like a soothing melody, calming him after the events of the evening. He looked up at the starry sky, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. At last, the weight on his heart had been lifted. On his way home, Samuel received a call from Charles. "Have you made it back yet?" Charles asked, his voice filled with concern. "No, I'm still walking. I needed some time to think," Samuel replied, his tone much calmer than it had been earlier. Charles exhaled in relief. "Good. I was worried they'd push you over the edge, but hearing your voice now, I think you've handled it." Samuel chuckled softly. "You were right, Charles. They tried everything to make me feel small, but in the end, I realized my worth doesn't depend on their approval." "That's the Samuel I know," Charles said, his pride evident. "So, what's next for you?" "I'm not sure yet," Samuel admitted, his eyes gazing into the distance. "But this time, I'll follow the path I truly want." The next day, as Samuel sat in his favorite small cafe in the neighborhood, sipping a cup of coffee, he received an unexpected phone call. The unfamiliar number made him hesitate before answering. "Hello, this is Samuel," he said politely, his curiosity apparent. "Hello, Samuel. My name is Richard, and I'm a lawyer representing a local business. I recently came across some interesting information and would like to discuss it with you. Could we arrange a meeting?" Samuel frowned, puzzled but intrigued. "Of course. Where would you like to meet?" 2 hours later, Samuel sat across from Richard, a middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp eyes, in a modest office. A thick file sat on the desk between them, and Richard flipped through its pages with a serious expression. "Samuel," Richard began, looking up. "I understand this may come as a surprise, but I need you to know this is a significant opportunity." "What are you talking about?" Samuel asked, his curiosity growing. Richard smiled. "The company Julian manages is facing serious issues. I learned this from some of his former clients. They're looking for someone capable and ethical to take over leadership, and after last night's events, a few of them suggested your name." "Wait," Samuel interrupted, unable to hide his shock. "Are you saying they want me to run Julian's company?" "Exactly," Richard nodded. "I know it sounds surprising, but I believe you're the perfect candidate. You have the experience, patience, and, most importantly, the moral integrity they're looking for. Moreover, with Julian's gradual downfall, this is an opportunity for you to prove your worth without seeking revenge." Samuel sat in silence, grappling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to reject the idea outright. He didn't want to be involved with anything related to Julian. But another part of him saw this as an opportunity to prove his true value without resorting to confrontation. "Let me think about it," Samuel finally said after a long pause. Richard nodded. "Of course. Take your time, but remember, this opportunity won't wait forever." In the days that followed, Samuel spent time reflecting. He wandered through his neighborhood, talked with Charles, and even met Natalie again at a small cafe. Natalie, with her bright smile, had become an unexpected confidant for Samuel. "Have you decided yet?" Natalie asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Not yet," Samuel admitted. "I'm not sure if I want to get involved in something so complicated." "You know," Natalie said encouragingly, "life sometimes puts us in situations we never expected, but that's how we discover ourselves. I think you should give it a try. Not to seek revenge, but to show that you're worthy of something greater." Natalie's words stayed with Samuel. He realized she was right. This wasn't about Julian or Ellen, it was about him. He needed a fresh start, and this could be his chance to make it happen. Finally, Samuel called Richard. "I'll do it," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Excellent," Richard replied, his tone revealing his satisfaction. "We'll start immediately. I'm confident you'll succeed." In the months that followed, Samuel worked tirelessly to restructure the company. Not only did he pull it back from the brink of bankruptcy, but he also transformed it into a positive and fair workplace. Julian's former employees, who had once felt overlooked, now admired Samuel's leadership. One afternoon, as Samuel sat in his office, a letter arrived. Opening it, he realized it was from Ellen. In the letter, she thanked him for everything he had done for her in the past and wished him happiness in his new life. Samuel folded the letter and smiled. He didn't need anything more. He had everything he needed: self-respect, joy, and a promising future. Standing by the window as the sun set, painting the city in vibrant hues of red and gold, Samuel felt at peace. His life was no longer burdened by the weight of the past but filled with hope and tranquility. Samuel's story serves as a profound lesson that a person's value isn't defined by wealth or status but by their character and resilience. The mockery and disdain of others cannot diminish someone's worth unless they allow it. Samuel teaches us that facing the past isn't about revenge but about freeing oneself and moving forward with dignity. Forgiveness, compassion, and doing what's right bring true happiness, no matter the obstacles.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.